Marvel Snap has seen many metagames and many broken cards, but what is the most broken card of them all? I've been playing Marvel Snap since day one, since wave season in the beta, so I am more equipped than most to be able to talk about what the most broken cards in Marvel Snap are across the entire history of the game. Let's count down the best cards in the history of Marvel Snap. Let's start with the original version of Galactus. Released as one of the original cards in the token shop, Galactus hit Marvel Snap with a bit of a whimper. He was originally regarded as a bit of a meme card, but gradually picked up steam as people realized that his gameplay could not be reasonably countered. Once Null released, it became very clear that Galactus and Null was a dangerous combination. Galactus would blow up the board, and then Null would be the largest creature of all time. In addition, because Galactus had only 2 power, and I'll get to this in a second, there's a little bit more to talk about here, it was a card that would be able to very easily throw priority in order to get that Null available with absolutely no real punish for it. You couldn't actually have a Shang-Chi or a Rogue able to hit that Null because the Galactus only had 2 power. Let's talk about what they did to change this card, and then talk about why it was reasonably effective. This card, as you can see, was a 6-2, but it didn't always start at a 6-2. It actually started as a 6-3, and it represented one of the worst balanced decisions that Marvel Snap has ever made. When they originally went to nerf Galactus, they didn't understand, as far as I can tell, what actually made the deck strong. So they took a point of power off of it without actually thinking about what the dynamics of the deck were. The dynamics of the deck were that it actually wanted to play this without priority. Because Galactus didn't have the requirement that he has today of having to win the location, you could play Galactus on whatever lane, and then everything dies, and then Null is the biggest guy of all time. And that allowed this deck to succeed in ways that no other deck could reasonably deal with unless they were stopping it from being the only card on the lane. This card famously got Nadeshot to tweet out about just how awful this card was for the game Marvel Snap. As far as I'm aware, that's actually the biggest influencer endorsement this game has ever received, is Nadeshot complaining about Galactus totally unprompted. I guess it is true what they say, all publicity is good publicity. So they nerfed it to 6-2, and this is actually when Galactus was at his strongest, was after that nerf. Galactus additionally had a bunch of other resurgences in small ways. Once they added the "you must be winning" clause to it, it was suddenly able to, when Elith came out, use that because, oh, you're winning the lane? Well, Elith is going to make sure you continue to win the lane, right? Galactus has been a problematic card throughout a wide variety of Marvel Snap, but for my money, this 6-2 version is the strongest he has ever been. It is absolutely not a card that can release, and I think it's a fun little story about how sometimes the devs don't even necessarily know what exactly is making a card the way that it is, and what the dynamics of the deck are at the highest levels, and how that can impact their nerf decisions. I will say, it's been a long time since they've made any kind of Galactus level slip up. This was a very early stage nerf kind of deal, and I think it demonstrates just how much better they've gotten at dealing with cards like this. Next up, we have original Darkhawk. This card has been strong enough that it has been nerfed multiple times. It currently has the same text at a full energy up and a full additional 2 power. Now, the reason this might not seem like as broken of a card as other cards is because you have to think about it in the context of what this card was at the time that it released. This was a card that was competing with White Queen. 4-drops have come a very long way since the time when Darkhawk was a major player in the metagame, and as a 4-drop, he was just consistently bigger and larger and more useful than anything else in his range. There was additional synergy with cards like Zabu that made him go a little bit over the top, and we'll be talking about everyone's favorite cat a little bit later. And Darkhawk also enabled a variety of disruptive strategies with the original 4-6 Rock Slide and 4-1 Darkhawk both benefiting from Zabu. They ended up nerfing Rock Slide multiple times in order to actually address this, as well as Darkhawk. And for that reason, I consider Darkhawk a worthwhile addition to this list, albeit a fairly understated one. Darkhawk was just good stats in an era where good stats simply did not exist, and it had synergy with good mid-range Zabu decks in an era when that was a very powerful thing to do, and it has consistently stayed a strong part of the metagame, thanks to the power of the disruption package for which it is the payoff. Darkhawk at 4-1 is definitely a worthy candidate for this list. Original Leech, the 5/3 on reveal that removes all the abilities from the cards in your opponent's hand. This one is an OG early release Marvel Snap banger. This is the card that I think pushed us into the new era of Marvel Snap, and I don't think enough people give credit to Dara for doing that. Before Leech really rose to prominence, almost every Marvel Snap deck was built around turn 6 point explosions, using on-reveal abilities, ongoing abilities, and discounts in order to create large amounts of power on the board. That's what people were doing. It was either that or they were doing it with tech. Those are the only kinds of decks that existed in that early Marvel Snap meta. When Leech came out, it changed that paradigm entirely. It became the first ever deck to really dominate priority and care about priority and get ahead and stay ahead. And not all of that was due to Leech. There's another card we're about to talk about that's about to go on this list as well, but a lot of it was due to Leech. Every deck in those early metagames was built on abilities. Cards needed to have abilities to do stuff, right? You're playing a Sarah deck, and whether or not you're doing points with that Sarah deck or tech with that Sarah deck, you need to be able to play those cards, and oftentimes you want to be throwing priority to avoid your opponent's tech. This deck, Leech Leader, was perfectly positioned to punish that, and I consider it Snap's first ever true mid-range deck. Of course, another major part of that is Leader, right? Like, Leader was an absolute monster, the ultimate in priority win cons. Basically, what this card said was, if you are ahead going into turn 6, or if you are within 4 points going into turn 6, you win the game. There were ways to counterplay it, but they were not particularly meaningful at the time. The ways to counterplay it mostly involved like making sure that you were able to be more efficient with your spaces so their leader wasn't able to copy anything. But that was very hard to do because you were probably a deck that was trying to play cards, and the leader decks were only playing one card a turn, so they were usually actually able to be more efficient with their spaces, so they had more spaces to do what they were trying to do, and also just copy all of your stuff. And that specific dynamic, I think, is what made Leader like this. Again, we talk about Leech Leader. What it was to me was an evolution in what Marvel Snap was. This is a deck that added depth to the game. Now, people understand priority-based decks. Oh, I want to be ahead so I can do this thing and slam the door, right? We understand what that is. Oh, I want to be ahead so I can, like, Elith you or whatever. Everyone understands that, right? I can Elith you, I can Cosmo you. That was not well understood at the time, and this is the card that made that kind of deck exist in the popular consciousness. This was kind of the other card that you'd play with Galactus. Some of your other lines with the original Galactus were like wave into Galactus into SpiderMan kind of things. And I think people really forget about this card when they talk about insane and busted cards in Marvel Snap. But this version of Spider-Man was broken in multiple ways. This version of Spider-Man, people famously remember Spider-Man Absorbing Man from the Zabu meta, right? Like you would Zabu into Spider-Man Absorbing Man. Remember, this is a 4-cost card at the time. People forget, though, about original high evolutionary decks. You just play this on 5 and then get all your high evo procs on everything. And so you basically had a Professor X that was cheaper. High evo Lockdown was a dominant, powerful deck that did a ton of incredible work, and a lot of it was due to Spider-Man being effectively Professor X, but it cost 4. And that is eventually what got it changed. It got nerfed to 5 during the reign of High Evo, so it was no longer, Professor X, but it cost 4. Now you weren't getting that free additional soak that it was providing. But eventually they were just like, no, this sucks. We have to get rid of it. Spider-Man is on here as a representative of that class of just awful 5-drops. It is best in class by far. Better than Professor X, better than Dr. Octopus. This is the guy. And I think it is very clear at this point, given like what they've turned what they've turned Professor X into. Like, this is an extremely dangerous, extremely powerful card. Frankly, I think it is, and probably will always be, one of the most underratedly broken cards in the history of Marvel Snap. All right, I guess it's time to talk about Loki. One of the things that a lot of people are going to talk about when it comes to really broken cards are cards that just fundamentally cheat energy in a dangerous way. Loki, I think, has always been a little bit overrated because of this, and because of how bad he feels to play against. For me, it wasn't actually a very hard choice choosing between Loki and Arishem to put on this list. Loki does what he does and did what he did at a much more powerful rate than what Arishem did. The most important thing about Loki that's really crazy about him, though, is that he released as a 3/5. It was just an egregious, ridiculous thing to release as. He was a very powerful card, and the way this card worked effectively was you would play a solid mid-range strategy full of all the really good cards, whatever they may be, and this, changed in and out. There were various iterations of Loki, but usually it typically was like Kitty Pryde, Angela type stuff. When Athena came out, it became Athena deck. It just adapted to whatever the good mid-range core was, and then Loki effectively meant that you won every mid-range mirror, because anyone else trying to play a mid-range sort of fair points, I'm going to play good stats for the cost and some interaction type deck, gets totally run over by the fact that you get their deck, do the same thing, and all of their efficient cards are even more efficient. That was Loki's ultimate role, is this mid-range bunker buster, basically. If you wanted to play a sort of semi-fair, silky smooth type deck, a bunch of cards that are like 2/5s that scale just a little bit sometimes, he's going to get those cards and they're going to be 1/5s, right? If you're playing efficient stats on curve, that is the specific thing that this card was meant to dominate. 6/5 Elith might be the most egregious balance miss of the last year or so, I would say, and that's including Loki, although I will say Elsa came out after him, so maybe that doesn't count. Blob came out after him, maybe that doesn't count. Elith is just a really difficult card to exist, and I think that's demonstrated by the fact that they eventually just took his text off of him entirely. Elith is now a totally different card with a similar dynamic, but not even close to the same level of power. So, the way this card worked when it first came out is it was a 6/5, and it destroyed every card your opponent played on that location. All of them. They all went away. It didn't matter if they moved away. It didn't matter if you had priority. It didn't matter if they had priority. None of it mattered. You played the 6/5, everything went away. You won that location. It did not matter. And in a metagame where there were so many SpiderMan alts, right? And I say SpiderMan alts to say cards that were able to win locations before turn 6, right? You had Professor X, that was obviously a ridiculous one. You had original Spider-Man a little bit, and you had, of course, the ability of this card to bring to bear Dr. Octopus even. So whatever you did, you would win another location guaranteed, and then you would play this, and then the game would end. And that's actually just the entirety of how this card played out. There have been other cards with that dynamic before. Obviously, Elith originally was just a major piece of Thanos because Thanos was the deck that was best able to accelerate out those Professor X's. At the time, it was known as W Thanos. It was named after a player named WW Los, who later changed his name to W. It was doubling up on 5-drop Spider-Man and 5-drop Professor X. And I believe 5-drop Spider-Man got nerfed right about the time this card came out, but I'm sure someone can correct me in the comments. Basically, though, the combo was Professor X. Professor X would come out, and then this card would come out, and then the game would instantly end, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. You'd turn 4 Professor X off the Time Stone, which I know this might be controversial. I have left Thanos off of here, but I have put a lot of cards that were good in Thanos on here. You can yell at me for that, I think. That's just where I'm at with it. Speaking of cards that were good in Thanos and were just kind of ridiculous generally, the original Blob actually just nuked your entire deck and took all of the power. And the reason this card is above Elith is they both existed at the same time. They nerfed Elith, and then suddenly everyone was just playing Blob anyway because it was basically the same as Elith, except you didn't need priority. The nerf they gave to Elith was that it required priority to work. Blob didn't require priority to work, which in the Thanos context allowed you to ramp out your Professor X, win that lane, do nothing, play Blob. Blob is the biggest guy of all time. He has like 50 power, and it doesn't matter. It turns out that erasing all of your opponent's stuff is the same as playing a 50 power guy there, right? And I think this is the sort of interaction that really sort of, not necessarily the first time I ever thought about it, but the first time it ever really crystallized to me that a lot of what card advantage is in Marvel Snap, of what going 2-for-1 is in Marvel Snap, is investing in a lane and overpowering your opponent's investment. If your opponent plays multiple cards in a lane, and then you play a Blob in that lane and win that lane anyway, those cards did nothing. And that is a fundamental thing that people learn from Blob, is that actually, look, it is actually able to effectively go 3-for-1. And when a card is big enough to overpower 3 cards in a lane, well, you only played 1 card, they played 3. It's very hard for you to lose the rest of the game when that is the way you are investing. Before we get into what I will say are probably the top 3, I did want to talk about some cards from the beta. And I don't think it's particularly fair to judge these cards by other cards' standards. They were cards that existed in the beta and were clearly designed more, I guess I would say, fancifully. Back before Marvel Snap knew what they had on their hands and was very much more just, hey, let's get Ben Brode in a room and have him throw ideas at the wall. First of all, I will say this. Chavez was a 6'10" for a brief time, but I think most people know her as this, a 6'9", with, of course, the ability to always be drawn on turn 6. Now, the reason this card is powerful is actually not very apparent, I think. It's not because you're playing it on turn 6, it's because it makes all your other cards more likely to be drawn before turn 6, and that's when important stuff happens, right? If you want to be playing a bounce deck, for example, drawing a card like Falcon or Beast on turn 6 is terrible. You want to draw those early. Chavez made that more likely. And that was true across basically every deck. If you wanted to play a game of Marvel Snap wherein you played specific cards on turns 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, she made that more likely. Chavez was perhaps not the most powerful card, but one of the most ubiquitous. Discard, I think, is actually still reeling from the loss of her. It's the exact kind of deck that needs her. You want to play Dracula on turn 4 and MODOK on turn 5. You want to have this stuff in your hand early. You don't want to be drawing it on turn 6. That's just awful. And so almost every deck of that style in the entire game was playing this card. I think, additionally, a deck like Destroy took a pretty reasonable hit to it. Again, that's a deck that really wants Deadpool on 1. It wants X-23. It wants these cards to happen early. And so anything that has a consistent game plan, that it needs to be more consistent and it needs to happen on turns 1 through 5, which there are very few decks in Marvel Snap that do not want some specific things to happen on turns 1 through 5, would play this deck. Would play this card, I should say. And so Chavez was nerfed, I think, honestly, for the sake of ubiquity. Almost every deck right now would be playing this card. It would be in almost every deck. And I think that is an example of why it got nerfed, because it's just not actually a game piece. You're not actually playing America Chavez to play the card America Chavez. You're playing America Chavez to influence the draw so that you do what your deck actually wants to do more. That's just not a fun thing to have in your game. This is what Magic used to be. And I realize that you might not understand exactly what's so ridiculous about this card. Well, it works on turn 6, so that's pretty much it. You would just randomly add a turn to the game. It's just awful. Just an awful thing to play with or against, is randomly adding a turn to the game on the final turn of the game. Not fun. Not a thing that anyone enjoyed. Extremely, extremely powerful, because your opponent is playing as if it is turn 6, right? They are making their big endgame plays. They're playing their big endgame dudes. Suddenly, there's a whole other 7th turn. You have a handful of tech. All that stuff they did is now terrible, and you blow them out. This card is unbelievably powerful. Like, just an absolute beast of a card. Even at these stats, it was a monster. We've talked about the messed up stuff that happened in the beta. I think this might be one of the ones people forget about. Just a pure ridiculous numbers card. Collector getting +2. Why? What was this? What was the point of this? Just a wild, ridiculous thing to ever happen. This was a card that I don't really think people got it. And I will say, one of the first pieces of Marvel Snap content I ever created was way back in the beta. I wrote a little paste bin guide to Bounce. And Bounce as a deck was so predicated on this +2. Like, yes, we had Bishop and Angela, but this guy was the guy. And so in some ways, I owe a lot to this card. I probably wouldn't have written that guide without him, and who knows if I'd be here if I didn't. This is the card that I think is most overlooked as a just numbers mistake from the beta. It seems very obvious, I would imagine, to everyone looking at this, that this card is like a 220 a decent amount of the time. If not a 220, it's like a 210, a 212. You play it in whatever bounce deck, everything scales higher. It's a ridiculous, ridiculous card that if you put it in front of any Marvel Snap player today, they would be able to reasonably intuit that it has way too many numbers on it. But at the time, that just wasn't a thing they were thinking about. I assume, honestly, that they were thinking this card would be a card for, like, Agent 13. Speaking of cards for Agent 13, Devil Dinosaur used to be a 3-0. When Marvel Snap first released into the beta, there was, like, one deck that was kind of just the deck at the time, and it was a Devil Dinosaur Moon Girl deck. Moon Girl actually used to cost 3. That's not necessarily as egregious as 3-0 Devil Dinosaur here. I'm giving them a pass on these. I think that, like, this and the next card could very easily be described as the most broken cards in the history of Marvel Snap. But since they're in the beta and since they were fixed so quickly and mostly before the actual game released, I feel like it would be a bit disingenuous for me to say these are the most broken cards in the history of Marvel Snap. On balance, though, this one might be. 3-0 Devil Dinosaur. I think we can all understand why that's ridiculous. We talked about Darkhawk at 4-1 being very good. Dino's very comparable to Darkhawk right now. It was a 3-0. So it would just be like 13. It would just be like 14 power. You'd play it for like 14 power, and you'd be able to make that happen because your deck would just be like Moon Girls. Sometimes you double this up. Just a bunch of ridiculous stuff. The deck was like Moon Girl Devil Dinosaur, and then like a Nova Carnage sub-theme. So like Nova at the time, not even included on this list because frankly, I think you could make Nova do this, was a 1-2 that gave +2 when it died. So you'd basically like, fill up the board, Nova Carnage, but you could also Moon Girl your Novas. So you'd have multiple procs of Novas, and then those Moon Girls would also allow you to have multiple Devil Dinosaurs. And so you just basically had these like massively wide and tall boards that were stronger than anything anyone else could bring to bear. And did I mention this was all Series 2? This is before most people got into Series 3. So also, we addition to that had Chavez and Jubilee. And because of the way old Chavez was coded, Chavez would basically always get pulled off the top of the deck when you played Jubilee. And that was like one of the lower powered things this deck could do. That was like a fringy addition. The meat of this deck was all stronger than having America Chavez's effect and guaranteed pulling her with Jubilee most of the time. Everything else this deck was doing was stronger than that. 4-4 Mr. Negative. I realize right now people might not understand what made this so completely ridiculous, but understand that this was a metagame that was not really the kind of metagame that understood what Leech Leader was. The only thing that mattered when this card was around was final turn point output, right? That's it. It's the only thing. And so when you compare this to the other Sarah decks of the time, Sarah Negative was able to do massively more point output for very obvious reasons. What are you actually giving up in terms of playing Mr. Negative instead? You're giving up like the ability to play Rescue. Remember, this is like old 4-drops. This is not the world of 4-drops that we had at the time. This is old 4-drops. 4-drops were not this. 4-drops were not what they are today. They were just all white queens, right? And so this card only being slightly worse and allowing you to play 0-cost Iron Man, Mystique, and then even if you missed on it, you could still just play those cards normally to output points. I think relative to everything else, this might be as strong as a Snap card has ever been. But again, you give them a little bit of a pass. It is the beta, and also, we were bad then. All right, let's get down to it. Zabu is third on the list. And the reason Zabu is third on the list and not first is because I have it on fairly good authority. I believe Glenn Jones has said publicly that Silver Surfer's win rate during Zabu's season exceeded Zabu's. And so if we know that, I think I kind of just have to give it to Silver Surfer in the comparison between the two. And there is a card that I think is better than Silver Surfer at doing what Silver Surfer did, which we'll get to. So, Zabu here, on the other hand, people remember this guy. This is a card that I think a lot of people will tell you is the most broken card ever, but I'm not sure he actually is. Here's where Zabu succeeds. It's one of the most powerful energy cheat cards to ever exist. One of the most powerful by an extremely large margin. And the reason it is able to be so powerful is, frankly, I think they just didn't get what they were doing at the time. As I recall, this is around the time Glenn Jones was hired, meaning like basically he walked into the office on day one and they had published Zabu, and now suddenly the first thing Glenn has to deal with is, oh my god, we made this card while I wasn't here. And that is one of the funniest things on earth to me. Zabu, on the other hand, was not funny. It was not funny, it was not fun. You'd play Zabu, if your opponent didn't play Zabu, you would snap because you'd win the game. There were a multitude of various finishers here. The one thing that really they all had in common was 4/6 Rock Slide and 4/1 Darkhawk. So they were all Rock Slide Darkhawk decks, but there was also Absorbing Man to copy the Rock Slides if you needed it, and then SpiderMan, so in case you had that Absorbing Man, you could just randomly win the game on turn 5 by saying your opponents couldn't play on 2 locations. The deck was oppressive, the deck was not fun, but it was a little bit finicky in a way that Surfer decks just never really were. Surfer decks were able to consistently output their points because they didn't need this card on 2. Surfer decks could get their card on turn 6, so I guess it's time to talk about Zabu's main competitor at the time, Original Silver Surfer. Original Silver Surfer, again, is just a bundle of stats, but what I think people might not understand about this card being such a good bundle of stats is that it's not just that, it also had a bunch of relevant proactive tech at the time. Like, yes, obviously, we had a bunch of powerful things to do with this card, but Silver Surfer was sort of the metagame police. It had access to tech cards like Cosmo and Killmonger that allowed the deck to succeed in ways that I don't think it was reasonably able to actually, be dealt with in that way. Like, this was a deck that was consistently outputting a lot of points with consistent relevant tech. In some ways, the first ever model of a modern Marvel Snap deck. And that's what this deck did that was so strong. Now, in terms of consistency, it was nearly unparalleled. You didn't need to have your key card by turn 2 the way you need with Agent Venom or Zabu. Your deck worked perfectly as long as you just drew this card at all. All you needed to do was have this card at some point in the game, and you would be playing, a 318, a 321, and that kind of subsidized power enabled you to play tech. And that is a concept that we come back to all the time, is cards that have a lot of ability to subsidize power across the board allow decks to play tech. We see that today with Agent Venom and Cosmo, and it's actually very reminiscent of Silver Surfer. Throughout all of Marvel Snap's history, there has been only one card released on the Season Pass that was nerfed in that same season. That card is Elsa Bloodstone. Elsa Bloodstone is so good that she made Loki a second-class citizen. Elsa Bloodstone is basically if Silver Surfer got to be played with way better cards. Same dynamic of it doesn't really matter when you draw it on turn 2, 3, 4, you're still going to be able to make it happen. It's not as freely in terms of draw as Silver Surfer is. Like Surfer you get on 6, but even an Elsa on turn 6 is still a 2/5 most of the time. This card was just a 2/11, a 2/14, a 2/17, and it allowed many of the same subsidizing things to happen. This is a common through line with cards that have just way too much power on them that can be distributed across the board, is that they free up space in the deck for you to run relevant tech cards. For example, when Mobius and Mobius came out, it just went straight into every Loki deck because you don't care, you're happy to run that card. It was a 2/3 at the time, you're even happier to run it, right? And when Loki was still running around, the main utility of Loki at the time was just getting a second Elsa. That's really all that he cared about, right? And so this card not only eclipses nearly every other card in terms of speed of response, it also, in my opinion, is the archetype for every card like it. A card that is such a powerful build around that manages to be so devastating, so dominant, so meta warping, so everywhere, and so freeing in terms of what else you can include in the deck. Elsa Bloodstone, to me, is the strongest they have ever had a card in open outside of the beta. Okay, so two things. The first is I've never done a video like this. I really hope people enjoy it and people are able to, I got a lot of feedback recently and people seem to enjoy when I just talk about stuff, and this seemed like a really fun topic to do. And so I really would appreciate if you leave some feedback, let me know what you think, and, obviously like and subscribe if you like it and you made it this far. The second thing is I realize I took some controversial stances in here, excluding a couple cards. The cards that I think could likely be on this list, I think Kitty Pryde, I think Wave, I think Thanos. I think most people are going to be mad at me about Thanos. But to me, Thanos was more of a card that enabled the, I guess, design mistakes of others rather than himself being so ridiculous. He was the shell, the good cards shell that went around the profound design mistakes. And we saw that with Arishem as well. Like, now that these decks do not have access to this kind of stuff, the Professor X stuff specifically, like the specific shell of like, I'm going to turn for Professor X you. Every deck that that had access to that was doing stuff like that, right? And it was just better than anything else has ever been. I think other possible exclusions here, Angela, actually a really good note, I think. I think that's an entirely plausible one to get on here. Cannonball, actually a really good note. I think that I covered that in terms of Professor X, but I did say that I considered Spider-Man stronger than Professor X, and the one area in which that was not true is with Cannonball specifically. If you disagree about any of those, I probably can't stop you from yelling at me in the comments, but hopefully you can understand exactly where I'm coming from on those. Kitty Pryde as an oversight is hard for me. I think she was, but she also literally broke the game, and that makes it harder for me to judge. And I think her original version would have probably ended up being like, actually on this list. But all of her previous versions, it's hard to figure out where to pin the blame. Do I pin the blame on Kitty Pryde, on Angela, on Thena, on Elsa? And I've chosen to pin the blame on Elsa, at least for the majority of the damage that she's done. As always, I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I just smashed the mic. That's your cue to yell at me in the comments. Have a good one.